Let's now have a look at the checkbox input. Under the inputs input directory, let's create a new one specifically for the checkboxes. We'll call it checkbox. And within this directory, let's create a new view file. So I'm just going to use a template here. It's going to be checkbox. And again, we're going to have a template section, script, export default, properties, data, and methods. Now, before we do anything else, let's register this component. So go into the components.js. I'm going to duplicate one of the last lines, and I'm going to change it to, rather than time input, it's going to be checkbox input. And it's going to come from input, checkbox, and the file is checkbox. Okay, if we save it and close it. Now, checkboxes have two statuses. It's either checked or unchecked. Now, by default, it's either going to return true or false, or it's going to have a flag like on, for instance, if it's checked. But what I want to do with our checkbox is to allow us to specify the value we will actually want to emit when it's checked and when it's unchecked. So if we want to, for instance, use A and B letter for checked and unchecked, we will be able to do it. Okay, so under properties, what we're going to start with is a property which will determine whether on unchecked should we remove the given input from the collection of fields. So the name of this property will be remove when false. And it will be of the type boolean. And by default, we will set it to false. So by default, it will not be removed from the collection that we're going to be sending with the request. The next property will be true value. So if we want to have a string, integer, or anything else, we will be able to specify what this true value should be when we are actually emitting it from this component to the wrapper. And the default will be boolean true. Then we are going to have false value as well. And this one by default will be false. So by default is going to be a boolean true or false. We also need to import our base input, so we have all those additional properties and functionality that every other input has. So import base input from base input. And now let's make sure that we have it within the mixins. So mixins, and we're using base input. Okay, the next thing we're going to do from within the data, we are going to have just one property called checked, and it will equal to whatever the new method is selected will return. So let's quickly add this method. Is selected method, what it will do is simply check if it will return the boolean true or false. This current value, the value that we're going to specify on this component, is a current value when the page loads. If we have pre-populated form, if we have some data that's already stored somewhere in some repository and we want to reflect it within the form, then obviously we're going to specify what this current value for this given input is. And if that equals this true value, then that should return boolean true, otherwise it will return false. So it will be selected if the current value equals true value. Then the next thing we're going to do is to create a computed section. And here what we're going to have is the property that's going to be called value to emit, because we're not going to be just returning true or false. We need to first find out what value should be emitted to the listener on the wrapper. So return, and we're going to check, is this checked? And if it is, then return this true value. So if it's a string, that's what's going to be emitted. Otherwise, return false value. Now let's add mounted section. So mounted. Once the DOM is ready, then what we're going to do, first of all, we're going to call this update method, which we'll create in just a moment. Let's just add the method stub here. So update. And then what we're going to do, we need to initialize our component. So let's just do this initialize. That's the method on our base input. Then we have this register listeners as well, another method on our base input. Now, if we go back to our base input, let's have a look at what else we need to actually do. So we are calling our initialize method, which will simply send all the validation rules to the wrapper. Then we also register the listeners for resetting and clearing the input. And what we need to do is to provide the implementation for the reset and clear method. So if we copy both of these, scroll down, and within the methods, let's paste these in, and let's remove this console log. For the reset, when we are resetting the form, what we want to do is to set our checked property back to what it was when the form first loaded. So this is selected method will return the value we're after. So what we need to do is from within the reset, we're going to go for this checked equals this is selected. And after this, we're going to call our internal update method. So this update, which will emit the event back to the wrapper. For the clear method, what we need to do is to make sure that checkbox is unchecked. So this checked will set to false, and again we're going to call update method to emit the event. Now you might be thinking, why have I chosen to have is selected as a method? It doesn't take any arguments. We could possibly have it as a computer property. The only problem with this is that we cannot access values rendered via the computed properties from within the data, and we obviously need that value for our checked property. That's why we had to have it as a method. Now, from within the update method, we are going to first check if the checkbox isn't checked, so isn't checked, and this remove when false is true. In that case, we are going to fire an event called remove -field, and then we are going to concatenate it with the group name. And then the value, the data that we're going to be emitting is going to be the name of the input. So our wrapper will receive this event, and then it will act accordingly. Obviously, after this, what we need to do is simply return to make sure that the statement doesn't go any further. But if it's checked, or if the remove when false is set to false, then what we're going to do is emit the event. So this emit method, which is obviously on our base input, and we are going to just call this value to emit. That's the value we actually want to send with this event. And let's quickly have a look at our emit method. As you may remember, by default, we've already specified that the event will be input. We could change it to a change event for this particular case, because obviously checkbox emits the change event as well, but I think input will work just fine. So we'll leave it this way. Okay, now let's have a look at the template. So template, we are going to start with the div, which we would want to only show. So v show when the show data property on the base input is set to true. Now let's add some class, and I've already added the class checkbox group item, which is available obviously with our SAS files. Then we're going to dynamically bind class for the computed wrapper CSS class. We're also going to apply style dynamically, so style, which is going to come from the computed wrapper CSS style computer property. Okay, and within we are going to have input, which will be of the type checkbox. Then we're going to bind ID as identity property. Then we have name coming from the name property. We have disabled from the is disabled property. Then we have autocomplete from autocomplete, all these usual suspects which we had with all the other fields. After autocomplete, we have class as well, input CSS class. Then we're going to have a vModel, and vModel will refer to our checked property. So checked, this one we can obtain the value on the go when it changes on the input as well. And on the change event, we want to call our update method. After this, we're going to have a slot, which will contain by default our validation. Now, we may replace it if we want to, that's why the slot, but by default it will have a validation coming from our validation component, which we've already included within the base input. If we go up, scrolling up, there we go, you can see our component validation is already available, because we obviously using this base input as a mixing. All those components that we also included within this mixing are available to us within any class that actually uses it. So for the validation for the label, we are going to use whatever comes from the label property. Then again, same thing, ID from identity, name from, again, dynamically name from name property, and then we have show, which will come from the show validation property. Then CSS class, which will come from the computed validation CSS class. Then we have validation with our messages, so validation, and the error, if there are any errors, from error property. And that's everything. If we now save, go back to our terminal and let's recompile everything. So npm run dev. Now that everything has compiled, let's go back to the editor. I have already added 3 checkboxes to my view, my index blade under the main directory. You will see we have a checkbox input with the name share. We have some label, model. We've associated with this particular one. It's on the props field share, name of the property. Then we have validation for required, and it needs to be within the A, which means the only acceptable value will be letter A. We've passed arrows. Current value we've set to A as well, so it's going to be checked. True value is A and false value is B. And for the validation CSS class, we've set it to block, which means that the container will have a display set to block, the CSS property. Then we have another checkbox input, similar thing. The only difference is we've set this remove when false to true. So when it's going to be unchecked, it should disappear from within the fields collection. And for the last one, we will simply have boolean true or false returned based on whether it's checked or unchecked, because we didn't strictly specify any other values for it. Okay, let's have a look at this in the browser. So if we refresh everything, you'll see these checkboxes down here. If I just go to the form wrapper, let's have a look at the values that we have on the fields. Object at the moment share is A. If I uncheck it, it sets to B, and so on. Now if I click on I agree with privacy policy, you'll see this privacy has been added, but when I uncheck it, it doesn't disappear. This is because we haven't provided any handler for this event that we're actually emitting. We will work on this in the following video. Now the last one we have for the I agree it's set with the terms and conditions. For this terms field, we have true and false. So when it's checked, it's true. When it's unchecked, it's false. Let's now move to the next video when we're actually going to work with this problem of removing the field from within the fields collection.